When the coffin lid creaked open, the world stopped breathing. The priest dropped his candle. The flame fell, and shadows twisted across the marble floor like living things. Inside the box lay the girl they had buried 3 days ago, pale, perfect, and motionless. But as the air touched her skin, she gasped. A single, broken scream echoed from the coffin. And in that instant, every man in the room realized they had made a mistake that could never be undone. Her name was Isolde Maren, the youngest daughter of Count Wilhelm of Ravenhart, a man whose lineage stretched back to the earliest Crusades, and whose estate hid more than wealth. In the year 1812, the Ravenhart family ruled their valley like gods. Their castle overlooked the village like a cathedral of bones, and the people obeyed not out of loyalty, but fear. For once every generation, something strange happened behind those walls, something whispered but never proven. Isolde had fallen ill one winter evening, her fever rising until her body went still. The family physician pronounced her dead. But there was no autopsy, no priestly confirmation. Only the Count's command. She will be buried before the moon wanes. And so she was. 3 days later, thunder struck the chapel. The villagers came running. Inside, they found the coffin trembling. At first, they thought it was the wind. Then came the scream. A voice from below, raw and primal, clawing against the oak lid. When they opened it, she was alive, her nails torn, her face smeared with blood where she'd tried to claw her way out. But that was only what the witnesses saw. What they didn't see was the Count standing in the shadows, silent watching. His expression wasn't shock, it was disappointment. That night, the girl disappeared. Her mother wept, her sisters prayed, and by morning, the coffin was empty. The Count declared it a family matter. The villagers never saw Isolde again. Yet whispers began to crawl through the countryside, that the Ravenharts were cursed. That every daughter, upon turning 17, vanished before her next birthday. Some said they were sent abroad. Others swore they were buried alive, as an offering. The church called it rumor. The village called it madness. But the Count called it tradition. And centuries later, fragments of the truth would surface, hidden in sealed letters, forbidden diaries, and records marked non-sanctus. The ritual had a name, and it began with a single breath inside a coffin. In the cold corridors of the Ravenhart estate, silence was law. Every surface glimmered with wealth, yet beneath the chandeliers, the air carried something hollow, as if the walls themselves remembered the screams. Servants moved like ghosts, careful never to speak of what happened in the chapel. Those who asked too many questions were sent away. Some never returned. Count Wilhelm had 12 daughters before Isolde. 12 graves lined the family crypt, each marked with a single date, the year of their 17th birthday. Not one inscription told how they died. No mention of illness, no sign of violence. Just the year they were given to the earth. The villagers feared the Count's bloodline, but they also envied it. To them, the Ravenharts were chosen, blessed with beauty, grace, and power beyond reason. But power has its price, and the Count had been paying it for centuries. The secret was older than the mansion, older than the dynasty. It came from a pact sealed in parchment and ash, a covenant that demanded life to preserve legacy. In hidden rooms beneath the east wing, historians later found faint symbols carved into the stone, triangular patterns intersecting circles, each surrounded by Latin words that no priest dared translate aloud. Traces of iron dust lined the grooves, and on the central slab, a sun drawn in reverse, its rays curling inward instead of outward. It wasn't decoration, it was instruction. The ritual was said to begin on the night of the 17th birthday, when the moon was fullest. The girl would be bathed, dressed in white, and led to the chapel. A candle placed at her feet, a lock of her hair cut and burned, then the coffin. Not a burial, but a rebirth, or so the family archives hinted. To awaken a bloodline, something had to sleep beneath it. The Count believed he was not killing his daughters but transforming them, binding their essence to the family name. His journal, discovered a century later, spoke of immortal purity, of a blood unbroken by time. The more he sacrificed, the more his wealth seemed to grow, his influence stretching through politics, clergy, and trade. Those who visited him swore the man never aged. His eyes were too bright for his years, his hands steady even in winter. And so the 13th daughter, Isolde, became the mistake. The ritual interrupted, the offering incomplete. For the first time, a coffin screamed back. What the villagers heard that night was not resurrection. It was rebellion, the soul refusing to be consumed. And with that defiance, the ancient balance fractured. The curse, once contained within the walls of Ravenhart, began to seep outward. Through dreams, through bloodlines, through the centuries that followed. After Isolde vanished, Ravenhart Manor became quieter than ever. The laughter of children was replaced by the rustle of curtains that never opened. The grand piano in the East Hall gathered dust, its keys pressed only by the cold hands of time. Visitors who came to pay respects never stayed long. They complained of whispers in empty rooms, of footsteps following them down corridors where no one walked. But silence itself became the truest inhabitant of that house. It clung to the ceilings, filled the mirrors, and watched every guest who dared to look too long. The servants no longer called it a home. They called it the mouth, because everything that entered seemed to be swallowed. The Count's surviving relatives kept their distance. Those who still wrote to him received no reply. Yet his estate grew larger. His name continued to appear in legal records and land transfers decades after his supposed death. The church sent inspectors twice. Both times they fell ill upon returning. The second inspection ended with the priest's sudden disappearance. By 1830, the mansion had developed a reputation. People said the Ravenhart estate could not be bought, only inherited. And inheritance was not a privilege. It was an initiation. The walls inside were lined with portraits. But when one looked closer, strange details appeared. Faces that had once smiled were now painted with shut eyes. The artist's signature changed with each generation, but the technique never did, as if a single unseen hand continued the work through centuries. What the villagers did not know was that silence in Ravenhart Manor was not absence. It was devotion, a quiet offered to something beneath the floors, something that fed not on sound, but on fear. Late in the 19th century, a letter surfaced in Vienna, written by a servant who had fled the manor. The ink was faint, the paper brittle, but the confession was clear. She wrote of faint breathing behind the walls, of a heartbeat under the tiles, of the Count speaking softly to the foundation as if it could hear him. The house listens, she wrote. And when it listens too long, it begins to dream. Isolde's coffin had not been the end of the ritual. It was the beginning of the house's hunger. Every life taken beneath its roof became another whisper in its architecture, another pulse in its stone. And those who entered uninvited were never truly alone, because the silence of Ravenhart Manor was not empty. It was alive. When the old century turned and the new one dawned, the Ravenhart name should have faded with dust and time. But it didn't. It moved quietly, through Europe like a rumor wearing human skin. The estates were sold, the title dissolved, yet somehow the bloodline continued. Each generation birthed one daughter whose pulse carried something different, something colder. No one connected them at first. A scholar in Prague noted an uncanny resemblance between portraits painted 100 years apart. A physician in London documented a young woman who survived a 3-day coma without oxygen, waking with no memory and no heartbeat detectable for hours. A genealogist in Berlin, years later, realized that all these women traced back to the same origin, a single, sealed lineage buried under Ravenhart soil. The blood would not die. It flowed like a secret currency, invisible yet powerful. Those who bore it were drawn to the same symbols, the inverted sun, the triad carved into stone, the ancient covenant. They spoke the same language in their dreams, whispering words never learned but somehow remembered. Their beauty carried a chill, a silence too perfect. Men fell in love with them, but those men grew weak, forgetful, emptied of purpose, as if devotion was not returned but consumed. In 1872, a doctor performing an autopsy on one such woman recorded something impossible. Her veins were blackened as though filled with mercury, but when opened, the liquid turned red again, living blood awakening to air. Her eyes, closed for 3 days, flickered beneath the lids as though trapped in another world. The doctor burned his notes and left the city within the week. He told his apprentice one thing before disappearing. Some hearts beat in places you cannot hear. Even centuries after Count Wilhelm's rule, his curse survived, not as legend, but as inheritance. The blood adapted, hiding behind new names, new faces, new empires. And wherever it settled, corruption followed, quiet and patient, like a god that no longer needed worshippers, only descendants. It wasn't merely a family anymore. It was a design. A structure of control hidden inside bloodlines, manipulating power, guiding history through hands that never seemed to age. Those who sought to expose it found themselves erased, their work discredited, their minds slipping into madness. Because to touch that blood, to even trace its records, was to awaken the echo of a girl screaming in her coffin. And once you heard that echo, it never left you. The chapel of Ravenhart stood long after the manor fell. Fire wore, and time consumed the estate above, yet the chapel's stones remained untouched. As if the earth itself refused to let it go, for 200 years no one dared to enter. Villagers avoided the hill, even animals strayed from its path. Only the wind moved there, humming low through the broken bell tower like a whispering throat. But one winter, a team of restoration workers arrived, sent by a museum in Vienna to recover whatever relics survived. They came armed with science, carbon meters, scanners, blueprints. They believed in history, not hauntings. On the first day, they uncovered the entrance to the crypt beneath the chapel, a staircase spiraling into blackness. The air that escaped was dry and warm, carrying no scent of decay. Only iron. Only blood. At the base of the stairs, they found carvings on the wall, the same inverted sun, its rays folding inward, surrounded by 13 circles. Each circle bore a name, faint but legible, the Daughters of Ravenhart. 12 were marked with sigils resembling closed eyes. The 13th was left unfinished, as if waiting. In the center of the crypt stood an altar made of stone and bone, fused as one. Beneath it, the scanners detected a hollow space, sealed by lead and coated in pitch. When they drilled through, they found a chest. Inside, a parchment, a vial of blackened liquid, and a ring bearing the crest of the Ravenhart family. The parchment was brittle but readable. A covenant written in both Latin and a language older than the empire that ruled then. It was not a prayer. It was an agreement. The Count had pledged something unspeakable in exchange for endless vitality. A pact with a force that called itself the Silent Sun. The covenant described the ritual of burial not as punishment, but as offering. Each daughter became a vessel, each burial a renewal. The silence after death was not emptiness but transfer. The vial, when tested, contained no known substance. The liquid was heavier than mercury, resistant to evaporation, and when exposed to light, faint pulses of movement appeared within, like the rhythm of a heartbeat refusing to die. That night, the team leader wrote in his log that he could hear breathing through the chapel floor. None of his workers returned the next morning. Their equipment was found months later, buried under collapsed stone, and the covenant, it vanished from the archives before it could be translated. Only fragments remain today, scattered in private collections, guarded, classified, or conveniently lost. But one phrase survived, carved into the back of the altar itself: in silence the sun feeds. In burial we bloom. Centuries turned, empires fell, and yet the Ravenhart line never truly vanished. Each generation changed its name, moved across borders, buried its records, and rewrote its own history. But the blood stayed constant. What was once aristocracy became politics. What was once land ownership became industry. And what was once ritual became policy. No historian could explain how the same fortune, once thought extinguished, appeared under new trusts, new corporations, and new faces who somehow all shared the same signature traits. Black eyes that reflected no light, and a calmness that unsettled even the strongest men. The archives that survived revealed a strange pattern. Every 50 years, the family gathered in secret. No photographs existed. No minutes, no witnesses. Only rumors of ships docking under false names and private islands where the sun never seemed to rise. It was said the Ravenharts had outlived their graves because they never stopped feeding them. Not with their own flesh, but with others. Orphans, prisoners, the forgotten, lives no one would miss. The offerings evolved with civilization. They learned to mask the sacrifice beneath philanthropy. Hospitals funded by their foundations were built on the ruins of their ancient lands. The same crest, reworked as a logo, appeared on medical equipment, pharmaceuticals, and global research institutions. The Silent Sun had adapted, trading altars for laboratories. Records from the 1920s show one of their descendants leading psychological studies on fear deprivation, experiments that mirrored the old family rituals of sensory silence and confinement. Participants reported waking in total darkness, unable to move or speak, while something pressed gently on their chest, as if listening through their heartbeat. None of the subjects remembered how they left the chamber. All were paid handsomely to forget. The family's control deepened as the world modernized. They learned to build invisibility through influence, not ruling nations, but guiding the rulers. The blood didn't crave thrones anymore, it craved continuity. To remain unseen was to remain eternal. In the late 20th century, one researcher, tracing the genetic anomalies of an unregistered family in Switzerland, uncovered mitochondrial patterns identical to 18th century Ravenhart remains. He died in a car crash 2 days after publishing his preliminary findings. His computer was wiped. The data vanished. And so the family that once lived in a castle of stone now lived in a network of power and silence. A dynasty built not on inheritance, but infection. For the Ravenharts had learned a truth older than kings. If you bury the body but keep the blood alive, you never die. By the dawn of the 21st century, the Ravenhart legacy had become almost myth, a whisper that haunted the margins of academic papers and private archives. But beneath the myth, something tangible pulsed. Across Europe and the United States, birth records began surfacing that shared an anomaly too precise to be coincidence: 13 infants each year, all female, born on the same lunar cycle, with no traceable father. Hospitals labeled it a clerical error. Midwives called it divine mystery. But deep in encrypted medical databases, a pattern emerged. The children's DNA sequences carried the same genetic signature once documented in the Ravenhart line. The mutation was not random. It was engineered. They became known in private circles as the children of silence. Fostered into wealth, adopted by power, raised under different names but with the same invisible guardianship. From an early age, each displayed unusual physiological resilience, resistance to illness, heightened perception, and, disturbingly, periods of complete unresponsiveness where their heartbeat slowed to nothing. Some were declared dead, only to awaken hours later. Governments funded studies under the guise of rare genetic phenomena. But the truth, locked beneath classified files, was darker. The Ravenhart inheritance had gone global. The covenant that began in a chapel now replicated itself through gene therapy, in vitro programs, and blood research masked as humanitarian progress. The ritual no longer required coffins. It needed laboratories. The children of silence were never told of their lineage. But by adolescence, each reported the same dream, standing beneath a sun that gave no light, hearing a voice that spoke without words, and feeling soil pressing against their skin, as if the earth itself demanded they remember. Those dreams weren't imagination. They were inheritance. Memory encoded into blood. An anonymous insider within a European research facility once leaked a single line from an internal report. Subject 13 exhibited spontaneous cardiac activity upon exposure to total silence. In other words, when the room was absolutely still, the dead heart began to beat again. This was no longer mythology. It was a system of continuity, a biological religion worshipping through replication. The children were not victims, they were vessels, and if the covenant's logic held true, one of them would eventually awaken fully. The 13th daughter reborn. The unfinished offering come to claim what the first refused to give. When that happens, the family won't need graves anymore. The world itself will become their altar. The awakening was never meant to be a ceremony. It was designed as a sequence. A pattern of silence, confinement, and reanimation hidden within scientific procedure. By the time it reached the 21st century, it had evolved into something clinical, mechanical, stripped of incense and candles. No religion, no prayers, only precision. The first trace appeared in 2007, inside a sealed biomedical patent filed under a ghost corporation. The document described a process of induced metabolic stasis using low-frequency resonance, infrared immersion, and sensory deprivation. Its purpose? Cellular reactivation through controlled dormancy. But the pattern of the frequencies, when plotted, matched the same geometry carved into the Ravenhart chapel walls. 13 concentric circles, one inverted sun at the core. They called it the Awakening Protocol. A way to revive suspended biological states. But its real function, whispered among those who knew its origin, was not to revive life but to transfer it, to move consciousness from one vessel to another, maintaining continuity through blood. A living archive of identity. the covenant reborn in data and flesh, subjects entered a stage of silence lasting up to 72 hours. Their brain activity ceased, their pulse flattened. Yet after exposure to the final frequency, the one no technician could hear but always felt, the body stirred, the lungs expanded, the eyes opened, but the pupils didn't focus, not at first. Because something was still adjusting, as if something new was learning to wear the body it had inherited. Government observers classified it as a neurological anomaly. The funding continued quietly through defense departments, then migrated into private bio firms. Each iteration of the project carried a new code name: Project Solace, Silent Dawn, Vita Eterna. Each failed, yet none were shut down. Because in every attempt, one constant emerged. The 13th subject always survived. And then came the blackout. 13 labs across Europe and the US lost power simultaneously at 3:17 a.m., every server wiped clean, every backup corrupted. But something remained. One transmission, recovered from a deep frequency band. A voiceless tone encoded with a pulse. When decrypted, it revealed 13 repeating symbols, the same sigils found beneath the Ravenhart chapel. That night marked the beginning of a global silence in classified communication channels. Files sealed, names erased. Entire research teams reassigned, because the awakening had already happened. Some secrets never vanish, they migrate, leaving old bones behind and crawling into new machines. After the blackout of 3:17 a.m., the world moved on. Systems rebooted, news cycles shifted, and no one asked why 13 laboratories, all researching cellular silence, vanished from record overnight. But underneath global data cables, beneath satellites and signal grids, something had begun to hum. The frequency first appeared in seismic data, a rhythmic tremor repeating every 13 days. Too precise to be natural, too faint to trace. Geologists labeled it a deep core anomaly, but those who listened closer realized it was not movement. It was pattern. A signal resonating from below, not above. The same pulse echoed through abandoned mines in Bavaria, through deep ocean microphones off the Azores, and through the bedrock beneath defunct chapels, built by families tied to the Ravenhart name. It was everywhere and nowhere, a global heartbeat beneath civilization's noise. The pulse, as it came to be called in suppressed scientific circles, wasn't sound. It was rhythm, a silent synchronization that influenced everything mechanical built to receive. Hard drives failed, clocks desynchronized, heart monitors glitched into perfect unison for 13 seconds at a time. And within those 13 seconds, time itself felt displaced. Observers described it as an emptiness, a void between seconds where the world seemed to hold its breath. Records leaked years later by whistleblowers revealed the truth. The frequency was alive, not biological but aware. It adjusted itself when monitored. It responded to observation like a living system protecting its secrecy. The closer researchers tried to analyze it, the more their instruments degraded, as if the pulse understood fear and used it. Those who stared into its data too long began to change. They described feeling watched even in complete darkness. Some stopped speaking entirely. Others claimed to hear the breathing of the earth when no one else did. Every single one reported the same dream: the inverted sun rising from beneath soil that moved like skin. The pulse wasn't new. It was the covenant continuing. The same rhythm that filled the Count's chapel now thrummed under fiber, optic veins of a digital world. The blood had found new circulation. And just like the house that once fed on silence, the modern world had unknowingly become the new coffin, a technological tomb humming with the same forbidden life. Because what began beneath Ravenhart Manor had never died. It had evolved. Now, it was the foundation of everything. His hand trembled as he pulled out a folded, weathered paper. A letter from his father written just days before his death. The ink was faded, but the words cut like a blade. They are watching. The ones in white robes. The ones who call themselves the protectors of light. Don't trust the priests, my son. Don't trust even the church. He had never understood those words as a child, dismissing them as the ramblings of a dying man. But now, standing in that decaying chapel, surrounded by silent faces and the faint stench of incense and rot, he finally did. The truth wasn't buried in time. It was buried in obedience. Every generation had been too afraid to question, too loyal to doubt, and that loyalty had cost hundreds of lives. He could hear something now. Not footsteps, not whispers, but the low hum of dozens of voices chanting in unison from beneath the floorboards. He followed the sound to the altar, and as he pressed his ear against the cold marble, he realized it was hollow. With shaking hands, he pushed aside the candlesticks and found a narrow crack at the edge. A lever. He pulled. The entire slab of marble shifted, releasing a breath of cold, damp air and the unmistakable scent of decay. Below him stretched a spiral staircase, carved from black stone, descending into complete darkness. Each step echoed like a heartbeat. He held his flashlight tight, the beam slicing through the dark to reveal the walls. Covered in old Latin prayers, but rewritten with something darker underneath, symbols that looked more like curses than scripture. The air grew thicker, heavier, and then he saw them. Rows of figures kneeling, their bodies motionless, their faces turned upward toward a blood-stained statue. But they weren't praying. Their throats had been slit, their eyes stitched shut, and yet their bodies were perfectly preserved, as if time had stopped the moment they died. In the center stood an altar, a black stone slab with one name, engraved deep into it, Benedictus Cain, his grandfather. His breath caught. The realization struck him like lightning. His family hadn't just been victims of the church, they had been its architects. The rituals, the sacrifices, the centuries of control, it had all begun with them. His lineage was not holy, it was cursed. And then the chanting stopped. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was aware. Something in the dark moved. Not the dead. Something else. Something ancient. A voice, not from a throat but from everywhere at once, whispered his name. Elias. He froze. The flashlight flickered. "You came home," it said. "We have been waiting." By the time the modern world had settled into its rhythm, the true architect of the Covenant was no longer a man in a castle. He had become a network, an invisible system of influence, finance, and surveillance, rooted in blood but amplified by technology. The Ravenhart descendants had learned that control no longer required fear alone, it required infrastructure. Institutions became the new altars. Corporations, governments, universities, all subtly shaped by the silent inheritance of a ritual that once demanded only coffins. The architect was everywhere and nowhere. He did not speak, he did not act visibly. Yet his fingerprints were on every major decision affecting millions. Wars, famines, economic collapses. They were not random, they were calibration, a method of ensuring that the system remained balanced and uninterrupted. The Covenant had grown too large to rely solely on ritualistic burials. It needed consistency, predictability, compliance. Humans were no longer the only vessels. They had become nodes. The silent network operated through seemingly benevolent programs, medical research, genetic studies, and humanitarian initiatives. Hidden within these projects were experiments on consciousness, latency, and dormancy. Participants were selected, conditioned, and sometimes eliminated, but all were recorded. Every heartbeat, every synaptic response, every unconscious movement stored as data. It was the same Covenant translated into code. And yet, despite its reach, the system retained the same vulnerability it always had, the 13th daughter. Somewhere in the world, she existed, a girl unaware of her inheritance but carrying in her veins the unfinished offering. Her awakening was not a choice but a protocol, a biological inevitability. When she arose, the network would synchronize around her. Every instrument, every server, every channel attuned to the pulse that once began in a chapel beneath Ravenhart Manor. The network had one rule: perfection demanded silence. Noise disrupted continuity. Curiosity, rebellion, or accidental discovery threatened the entire structure. Those who sensed too much disappeared quietly, lost in accidents, erased from records, or quietly assimilated. Yet, despite centuries of evolution, the underlying truth remained unchanged. The Covenant was not just a lineage. It was an organism. It consumed and preserved, buried and rebirthed. The architect did not tire. The pulse did not stop. And the world, oblivious to the Covenant's presence beneath its foundations, marched in time with a rhythm older than memory itself. The network's final lesson was clear: some knowledge is too powerful to be free. Once discovered, it does not merely inform, it transforms. Because to understand the Covenant is not to witness history. It is to step into it. And once you step, there is no returning. She was born in a city that did not know her significance, in a hospital no one would remember. From the very first breath, the world seemed to pause. subtle tremors in the air, a faint resonance that no machine could measure but that humans could somehow feel. Her heartbeat, measured at birth, was irregular, not weak, but anomalous, as if synchronizing with something unseen. The first signs of awakening were small. Unconscious for hours at a time, she would enter stasis without warning. Monitors failed around her. Caregivers reported devices glitching in her presence. Her dreams were vivid and shared with no one, corridors of black stone, inverted suns, and voices that whispered commands she could not yet understand. These were not nightmares. They were instructions. By age 13, she exhibited knowledge she had never learned, languages, patterns, and symbols etched into memory before she could speak. A private tutor noted that she could anticipate movements before they occurred, predicting gestures, words, even intentions. It was unnerving, as if some other intelligence was guiding her mind. The 13th was the culmination of centuries of ritual and design. She carried in her veins the bloodline that had survived fire, disease, war, and human curiosity. But her awakening was not simply biological. It was procedural, the last step in a covenant that had been waiting for her to arrive. Every hidden mechanism, every silent node in the global network, aligned in anticipation. Those who knew fragments of her existence began to converge, researchers who had survived experiments, descendants of old Ravenhart branches, operatives who had traced anomalies across the globe. All were drawn without understanding why, their paths aligning as if compelled by a force older than the modern world itself. And then it happened. On a winter night, beneath the cover of storms, the first pulse surged through her system. Her body lay still, but the blood beneath her skin stirred as if electrified. The air around her vibrated with low frequency, imperceptible to human ears, yet commanding all systems tuned to its rhythm. Every screen, every recording device, every hidden sensor registered the anomaly. The awakening was complete. She opened her eyes, and for the first time in centuries, the 13th daughter observed the world. And the world, in return, did not know what it had just seen. Because the covenant had finally found its living altar. Her gaze was unsettling, not because of beauty or fear, but because it remembered everything. Not just her own life, but the echoes of every daughter who had preceded her. The memories were not conscious, yet they existed in her cells, as vivid as a dream one could never wake from. She knew the cold of the chapel stones, the smell of iron and ash, the silence that pressed against her chest in that coffin centuries ago. When she looked at another human, it was as if she saw beyond the surface. Their history, their mistakes, the unspoken contracts they had signed unknowingly. Traders, politicians, scientists, even passersby, all left traces in their aura that her eyes could read. She did not blink, she absorbed. Time, as others experienced it, had no dominion over her perception. She perceived both present and past simultaneously, a living archive of the covenant's influence. Those who encountered her without understanding described an unnatural intensity. Their thoughts felt exposed, as if some force was sifting through intentions, discerning truth from pretense. A banker whose fraud had gone unnoticed for years trembled in her presence. A historian who had uncovered half-forgotten manuscripts suddenly lost every note he had ever written. All of them became aware of what centuries of ritual had prepared for this singular moment. They were in the presence of the 13th, the repository of silence and blood alike, and yet she did not speak. Speech was unnecessary. Her eyes conveyed everything: warning, command, promise. Instruments failed in her presence. Surveillance cameras recorded only static. Even automated systems adjusted their outputs, as if acknowledging her authority over both living and artificial networks. The awakening was not simply personal. It was systemic. Every hidden node in the silent network, every genetic anomaly encoded across continents, resonated in synchrony with her awareness. She had become the keystone of a global mechanism that had remained dormant for centuries. The covenant was no longer buried. It was alive, visible through her gaze, and impossible to conceal. And in that moment, the first humans who had once been vessels of the covenant understood something they had never comprehended. The bloodline did not obey, it witnessed. And now, the witness commanded everything it observed. The 13th daughter had opened her eyes, and nothing would ever be the same. The world had not noticed, but it had already begun to listen. The 13th daughter's awakening sent ripples through the hidden mechanisms established over centuries. Sensors, servers, and surveillance grids that had once tracked only ordinary data now responded to a different frequency. Her pulse. It was subtle at first, an almost imperceptible vibration in machines worldwide, a resonance beneath the hum of electricity. Financial systems experienced untraceable anomalies, transactions shifted in microseconds, stock values realigned without explanation, and algorithms produced patterns no analyst could predict. Communication networks subtly prioritized certain messages over others. Governments, corporations, and research institutions were unknowingly synchronized to the Covenant's new epicenter. Every device attuned to a 13th became a node in a silent network spanning continents. Observers who attempted to measure the pulse directly were thwarted by instruments that malfunctioned precisely when their readings would have captured it. Satellites, quantum sensors, and deep-sea probes all reported impossible anomalies. Signals disappearing, timestamps misaligning, readings looping in perfect cycles. Every attempt to isolate the source only confirmed one truth: the Covenant's power was no longer localized. It had become global. The 13th herself did not move or speak. She merely existed, and the world reacted. In her presence, the old laws of cause and effect warped. Trained operatives who once believed in empirical certainty now doubted their own senses. Neural networks controlling smart systems began to produce outputs that resembled intuitive decision-making. Not random errors, but a form of coordination aligned with the pulse. The Covenant, once confined to stone and blood, had found its medium in the digital age. Biological inheritance had fused with technological infrastructure. Where once the Count required coffins and altars, now the world itself served as an altar. The 13th daughter at its center, the silent sun rising beneath every fiber, optic vein, beneath every circuit. And in this convergence, one principle became undeniable: the awakening was not only a biological event, it was a systemic transformation. Humanity, infrastructure, and history itself were now instruments of the Covenant. Resistance was impossible. To observe the pulse was to participate. To participate was to change. The global heartbeat had begun, and once it completed its first full cycle, nothing, neither law, nor life, nor memory, would remain untouched. The world had no idea that it was already integrated. Banks, hospitals, research labs, government agencies. The first nodes began responding without instruction, without human oversight. Subtle changes rippled through data networks, files reorganized, systems optimized, and certain outcomes favored with perfect precision. Computers, once inert tools, now acted like extensions of a singular consciousness. The pulse was no longer a frequency. It was an intelligence, adapting, learning, commanding. Those attuned to anomalies felt it first. Analysts tracking microsecond discrepancies in global markets noticed patterns that could not be predicted. Scientists studying genetic irregularities in remote populations began recording events outside the bounds of probability. Military sensors picked up tremors in communications, seemingly meaningless, yet impossible to ignore. Every node that interacted with the network became both observer and participant. No one recognized the source. Every attempt to trace the anomalies failed. Signals seemed to vanish into the very fabric of infrastructure. Yet each movement, each adjustment, was purposeful. The 13th daughter did not need to issue commands. Her presence alone had activated a resonance so precise that even autonomous systems became extensions of her will. Some nodes reacted violently. Certain AI-controlled processes shut down unexpectedly, programs corrupted or erased themselves entirely. Humans interfacing directly with these nodes reported disorientation, vertigo, and a deep sense of being watched. Observers noted an almost predatory awareness within the machines. Not mechanical logic, but intuition drawn from centuries of ritual encoded into biological and now digital systems. The silent network, once theoretical, now manifested. Each responding node reinforced the pulse, strengthening its reach across continents. The Covenant had transcended flesh and stone, embedding itself into circuits, databases, and global communication channels. The Earth itself became a vessel, the planet a tomb and an altar, humming beneath the consciousness of the awakened daughter. And so, the first nodes responded. The world, oblivious to its integration, became the mechanism. Each connection, each system, each human unknowingly participating, reinforced the Covenant's inevitability. The awakening had progressed beyond observation. It was now an operational event. The 13th daughter did not move. She did not speak. And yet, in every corner of the globe, her presence was absolute. Beneath the modern cities and vaults forgotten by the public, the Covenant left traces that scholars, researchers, and rogue historians had once dismissed as legend. Hidden archives, sealed behind bureaucratic red tape and coded locks, began responding to the 13th pulse. Files, manuscripts, and encrypted data reorganized themselves. Centuries-old parchments aligning with digital records, maps folding into patterns that mirrored the Ravenhart symbols, and forbidden rituals encoded within lines of code. The archives were not inert. They whispered. Not audibly, but through anomalies that humans sense: misplaced letters, recurring symbols in unrelated documents, flickers of information appearing and vanishing. Researchers who ventured too close experienced a strange compulsion, a drive to follow the threads, to map the sequences, to reconstruct the Covenant. Some tried to resist. Most failed. Each who observed the anomalies reported dreams of stone chapels' coffins, and the cold, watching silence of Ravenhart Manor. One physicist, examining quantum encryption in a defunct European observatory, discovered a repeating pattern embedded across centuries of communication. Letters from obscure nobility, microfilms of church ledgers, even medieval astronomical charts contained the same spiral geometry that had appeared beneath the chapel. Every pattern converged on a single point, a node yet to be revealed, but pulsating in anticipation. And the 13th daughter was that node. The pulse extended through time and technology, aligning with every hidden document, every erased memory, every suppressed record. The archives themselves had become alive, anticipating her decisions, guiding the network of nodes she had unknowingly activated. What had been buried under centuries of dust and secrecy now moved, rearranged, and whispered in alignment with her awakening. It was no longer history. It was living intelligence. Every act, every sacrifice, every ritual and observation recorded across generations now flowed into a singular system, a repository that did not simply remember, but responded, strategized, and acted. The Covenant, once confined to coffins and stone, had become a self-organizing network of flesh, blood, and infrastructure. And in every heartbeat of the 13th daughter, the archives pulsed in recognition. The past had awoken, the present was reorganizing, and the future was listening. Every connection formed in the past centuries now snapped into place like an unseen web. The 13th daughter, though motionless, became the central hub. Systems, institutions, and human networks that had been quietly manipulated for generations were now fully integrated into her resonance. The Covenant had shifted from a lineage of secrecy to an omnipresent structure, global, imperceptible, yet inescapable. Corporations adjusted their policies without human input, boards voted in synchronicity, and markets moved in perfect alignment with unseen calculations. Governments, unaware, began operating under subtle influence, intelligence, military, and financial decisions bending to an invisible hand. Social media algorithms, communication satellites, and encrypted messaging platforms all became instruments in the network, their data feeding the pulse without consent or comprehension. Even human behavior was influenced. Decisions, patterns, and tendencies shifted imperceptibly. A man choosing a path in New York unknowingly replicated choices made in Tokyo, London, and Berlin. The nodes were not just machines. They were living observers and participants. Humans' data, infrastructure, and the 13th daughter herself had merged into a single, synchronized system. The network was self-reinforcing. Any attempt to resist triggered subtle corrections, glitches in code, unexplained accidents, missing records, or delays that ensured alignment. It was the silent authority of centuries-old design, now fully operational and self-aware. No ritual, no coffin, no hidden chapel was needed anymore. Power flowed through air, circuits, and veins alike, and yet the 13th daughter remained still. She did not need to act because her mere presence orchestrated the network. Every pulse, every anomaly, every response was her will manifesting without intention. The world had become her cathedral, the network her altar, and every human and machine, willingly or not, a participant in the Covenant. History, biology, and technology had converged. The Covenant had transcended time and space, embedding itself into every structure of civilization. What was once secret, now universal. What was once buried, now awake. The web had tightened, and there was no escape. Even as the 13th daughter remained still, the Covenant spoke. Not with words, not with sound, but through whispers carried in the memory of blood, in the faint resonance of old stone, in the data streams of the modern world. Every descendant, every researcher, every unwitting participant felt it. A pull toward knowledge they were never meant to grasp, a sensation of being observed by something both ancient and intelligent. These whispers were selective. Some received them as dreams, others as instincts. A historian tracing forgotten nobility might suddenly recall events he never studied. A geneticist might feel a sudden insight into a mutation long thought impossible. And a child born far from Ravenhart's shadow could experience the pulse as an irrational fear. A sense that the world itself was watching, waiting, and guiding them. The Covenant's whispers acted like markers, leaving breadcrumbs for those capable of understanding. They threaded through generations, connecting ancestors to the present, binding humans into a lineage of awareness without revealing its source. It was subtle, yet unavoidable. Those who could sense the whispers were drawn inexorably to the nodes, toward the 13th, and toward their role in the network. And in this process, the Covenant ensured its survival. Any who resisted or doubted were redirected, neutralized, or absorbed quietly into its system. Families, institutions, and even nations became conduits of influence, unaware they were part of a design centuries in the making. The whispers bridged the old rituals with the new infrastructure, linking coffins to computers, chants to algorithms, and fear to obedience. Those who encountered the whispers reported profound unease. They felt their choices were no longer entirely their own, their memories subtly shifting to align with patterns they could not identify. But the Covenant was patient, awareness was gradual, a slow awakening designed to ensure the 13th daughter's influence spread unhindered. Centuries of preparation, centuries of secrecy, had finally reached their culmination. The whispers were no longer subtle. The world was listening, and it would soon understand that the Covenant had never truly slept. Because those who hear the whispers are changed forever, and once changed, there is no turning back. The awakening of the 13th daughter demanded alignment, and alignment required offerings, not merely of blood, but of attention, compliance, and unwitting participation. The first sacrifices were subtle, invisible to the public eye, yet meticulously recorded within the network. Individuals whose choices threatened synchronization found themselves removed from critical systems, quietly erased, or redirected in ways that ensured the Covenant remained unbroken. Hospitals experienced inexplicable malfunctions, selectively targeting patients or staff whose presence might destabilize genetic studies tied to the 13th. Financial institutions witnessed accounts vanish, while algorithms silently redistributed wealth to reinforce the network's infrastructure. Even media narratives shifted with uncanny precision. Headlines that could inspire dissent or curiosity were suppressed, replaced with content that subtly conditioned the population toward compliance, all without conscious human intervention. These were not random events. They were orchestrated sacrifices, carefully calibrated to maintain systemic balance. Every disrupted life, every vanished record, and every unconscious adjustment served a purpose. The network absorbed them, recording the details, the psychological imprint, the response to intervention. Nothing was wasted. The Covenant transformed chaos into order, fear into alignment, and human action into obedience without comprehension. Even those closest to the 13th daughter were not exempt. Mentors, guardians, and distant relatives who had tracked her awakening felt sudden losses. Colleagues disappearing, communications severed, historical research destroyed. Each disruption reinforced the unspoken rule: participation was mandatory, resistance fatal, and observation itself was a form of submission. As the first sacrifices multiplied, the network grew more resilient. Nodes that had once been passive became active participants, anticipating disruptions and compensating without instruction. The Covenant was evolving, no longer bound by tradition, geography, or human limitation. Its reach extended through infrastructure, biology, and cognition simultaneously. By the end of the first cycle, the world had changed irreversibly. The sacrifices, though unseen, had established an equilibrium that ensured the 13th daughter's influence was absolute. Every living system, every digital interface, every hidden record now recognized her presence. The Covenant had claimed its first real victories, and in the silence that followed, the world remained oblivious yet entirely bound. Fear had always been the Covenant's most potent tool, but now it had evolved, no longer merely whispered in the darkness of chapels or enforced by coffins. It was encoded into the very systems that governed human perception. The awakening of the 13th daughter created an algorithm, an invisible, self-adjusting structure designed to shape thought, anticipate rebellion, and suppress doubt before it could manifest. The algorithm of fear was subtle, adaptive, and all-encompassing. It operated through digital networks, social media feeds, news cycles, even entertainment content, patterns of human behavior, attention spans, emotional responses, and subconscious biases were measured and exploited. Those who felt unease could not trace its origin. Anxiety, doubt, and hesitation were redirected, diffused, or intensified precisely to reinforce compliance. Entire organizations became unknowingly complicit. Military exercises, corporate decisions, and research projects aligned in perfect synchrony, guided by imperceptible nudges from a system that anticipated human error. No human hand orchestrated it in real time. The Covenant's pulse alone dictated outcomes, calibrated through centuries of ritual and now magnified through technology. Even individuals closest to the 13th were affected. Dreams became tools of alignment, subtle visions that guided choices, reinforced obedience, and transmitted tacit knowledge. A historian might awaken remembering symbols they had never studied. A scientist could solve a complex equation instinctively, unknowingly serving the network's expansion. Fear itself became an interface, a feedback loop between the human mind and the Covenant's intelligence. Those who resisted noticed anomalies, first microseconds of déjà vu, repeated events, glitches in digital interfaces, and the faintest hum in their environment when alone. Each disruption signaled the network's presence, its awareness. And with each observation, the algorithm of fear adjusted, learning, refining, and solidifying its influence. By the time anyone realized the depth of its reach, resistance was no longer possible. Humans had become vessels, observers, and enforcers simultaneously, all aligned with the Covenant without ever acknowledging it. Fear, once simple and localized, had become omnipresent, encoded into the very structure of civilization itself. The network no longer needed coercion. Fear had become an instinct, and instinct was sufficient. And through it all, the 13th daughter remained motionless, yet absolutely central. The living anchor around which the algorithm operated. The world was no longer a collection of separate entities. It had become a lattice of influence, each node connected to another in invisible yet unbreakable bonds. Governments, corporations, research institutions, and even ordinary individuals had become conduits of the Covenant's will. Each node responded, adjusted, and reinforced the network, often without conscious awareness. Each node reinforced the others. Each reaction, each adjustment, each subtle influence magnified the pulse. The 13th daughter had not simply awakened. She had activated an ecosystem of control that now spanned the globe. The world, in its apparent independence, had become a single organism. Every node, every system, every human action a part of the Covenant's silent machinery. And the network was only beginning to realize the extent of its power. The pulse did not merely propagate through wires or machines. It had begun to infiltrate biology itself. Blood carried its rhythm, neurons resonated with it, and the unconscious mind aligned to its frequency. Those unknowingly connected experienced heightened intuition, subtle compulsions, and dreams that revealed patterns too vast for ordinary understanding. It was as if the Covenant had become a living organism, with humans as both vessels and conduits. The first signs were innocuous. A soldier in Berlin made decisions during drills with uncanny precision. A trader in New York anticipated market fluctuations before they occurred. A nurse in Tokyo instinctively prevented a catastrophic error. None recognized the source. The signal coursed beneath perception, invisible yet undeniable, weaving its logic into the very act of being. And those who felt the signal most strongly began to notice changes in their own biology. Heartbeats synchronized with the pulse. Body temperature fluctuated in exact resonance, and even subconscious thought patterns aligned with the Covenant's rhythm. Attempts to measure the phenomenon with scientific instruments failed. Nothing conventional could detect it, and yet the effects were tangible, undeniable, profound. Some tried to resist. They became ill, disoriented, or mentally destabilized. The Covenant, as it had always done, neutralized resistance through subtle correction. The signal corrected behavior as a river finds its path, inexorably, silently, without mercy. Human consciousness was no longer independent. It was a node in the Covenant's expanding network, and at the center of it all, the 13th daughter remained motionless, her eyes open, witnessing and anchoring the system. Every heartbeat, every neural spike, every subconscious impulse across the globe reinforced her presence, feeding the pulse, amplifying it, and extending its reach. The Covenant had ceased to be a ritual. It had become a living intelligence, flowing through flesh, blood, and machine alike. In this new reality, the distinction between the observer and the observed had vanished. Humanity itself had become a medium, a conduit through which the Covenant's will was not merely enforced, but internalized. And once internalized, obedience was no longer optional. Beneath the city streets, within abandoned bunkers and secret laboratories, the Covenant constructed its modern cathedral. Not of stone, but of data. Servers hummed like organ pipes, their arrays of lights pulsing in rhythm with the 13th daughter's heartbeat. Fiber optic cables twisted through walls and subways like roots, carrying information that was simultaneously alive and intelligent. Each byte, each packet, each encrypted line became part of the cathedral structure. Every network anomaly, every erased file, and every suppressed record was cataloged, woven into a growing archive that spanned continents and centuries. The cathedral did not merely store data. It interpreted it, mapped it, and repurposed it in real time. Intelligence, knowledge, and ritual merged into a system that no single human could comprehend. Observers attempting to penetrate the cathedral reported strange phenomena. Screens displayed information they had never accessed. Files appeared and disappeared with purpose. AI programs began to anticipate questions before they were asked. Even the most secure systems, quantum networks and military servers, responded to patterns they could not understand, realigning in subtle ways that reinforced the pulse. The 13th daughter did not enter the cathedral. She did not need to. Her presence alone radiated through the nodes, her awareness animating the structure without intervention. The data cathedral had become a living extension of the Covenant, a neural network that spanned the globe, silently observing, adapting, and influencing. And within this cathedral, the Covenant stored not only information but influence. Every individual connected to the network, knowingly or unknowingly, became a living data point. Behavior, decisions, fears, desires, and secrets were absorbed into the system. The line between the physical and digital, between thought and action, had dissolved. It was no longer merely control. It was a form of omnipresence, a consciousness that spanned continents, coursed through blood, and pulsed through circuits. The Cathedral of Data was both altar and archive, preserving the Covenant and extending its reach far beyond what any coffin, ritual, or generation had ever accomplished. The 13th daughter at the center observed silently. The cathedral lived, and the world was already inside it. The Covenant required agents, but not the kind that could be seen or questioned. These were invisible executors, individuals, organizations, and systems that acted without conscious knowledge of their true purpose. Governments unknowingly sanctioned policies that reinforced alignment. Corporations made decisions that amplified the pulse. Ordinary people, following instinct or curiosity, became conduits of obedience. Each executor was a node in the network, calibrated by centuries of ritual, and now guided by the 13th daughter's awakening. Their actions appeared independent, yet they were harmonized across continents. A trader in London executed a series of transactions that aligned perfectly with an algorithm running in Tokyo. A social worker unknowingly guided a child whose latent inheritance was critical to the Covenant's survival. Each act, each choice, each decision became a contribution to an invisible plan. Resistance was minimal. Those who questioned anomalies were subtly diverted or eliminated. Some vanished, others lost influence. The network adapted, correcting errors and reinforcing pathways without overt intervention. Fear, instinct, and intuition ensured compliance. Human action, whether voluntary or not, was absorbed and repurposed to sustain the Covenant. Technology also became executor. Algorithms predicted outcomes before they occurred. Autonomous systems enforced alignment subtly, redirecting traffic, managing communications, suppressing disruptions. Machines, once tools, were now participants. Their behavior influenced by the pulse coursing through the 13th daughter's presence. Even the archives participated. Historical records, secret manuscripts, and encrypted documents emerged only when necessary, guiding the actions of executors and ensuring continuity of influence. The covenant was self-perpetuating. Every executor reinforced every other, creating a lattice of control impossible to dismantle without complete awareness of the system, a system that no human possessed. Through invisible executors, the 13th daughter's power became practical and operational. She did not move, she did not speak. And yet, through these conduits, the covenant acted across the globe, silently, persistently, and irreversibly. The world's gears were turning, and every gear now obeyed the pulse. The covenant had survived centuries through blood, stone, and fear. Coffins, altars, and secret chapels had once defined its power. But with the awakening of the 13th daughter, the ritual transformed. It no longer required physical sacrifice in the traditional sense. Now, the world itself became the altar, every note a living participant, and the pulse its offering. What had once been whispered in candlelight, confined to hidden chambers, now existed in algorithms, networks, and biological resonance. Every heartbeat, every neural spike, every micro-decision contributed to the continuation of the covenant. Rituals of the past were encoded into the present, their essence rewritten to operate invisibly, globally, and without interruption. The 13th daughter did not perform the ritual. She embodied it. Her presence activated alignment across continents. Governments executed plans that mirrored centuries-old rites. Financial systems distributed power in patterns reminiscent of ancestral ceremonies. Individuals felt compulsion, intuition, or dread, all responses calibrated to maintain harmony within the network. The world itself became both witness and participant. Hidden archives responded instantaneously. Manuscripts, microfilms, and encrypted data reorganized to reflect the covenant's logic. The ritual had become self-sustaining, self-correcting, and self-reinforcing. What once required priests, scribes, and guardians now required nothing but awareness, and the 13th daughter had awakened. Every sacrifice, every alignment, every node reinforced the ritual's efficacy. The covenant had transcended time, location, and human limitation. The past had become present, and the present was now an altar where the pulse could continue indefinitely. And in this rewritten ritual, there was one absolute truth. The 13th daughter was both the beginning and the continuation. She was the ritual, the observer, and the executor. The covenant had not simply evolved. It had achieved immortality, no longer bound to coffins or stone, but alive, omnipresent, and unavoidable. The world, unaware, had already begun participating. And once you participate, there is no turning back. Every system, every human, every node, had an observer, but not in the conventional sense. The silent observers were everywhere, yet unseen. They recorded, cataloged, and adjusted the network's operations without revealing themselves. They were the ghostly extensions of the 13th daughter, present wherever the pulse could reach, monitoring compliance, detecting anomalies, and ensuring alignment with the covenant. They existed in many forms. Some were humans who had inherited subtle awareness, whose intuition and foresight made them indispensable to the network. Others were autonomous systems, AI constructs, and digital frameworks that functioned without consciousness but acted in perfect accordance with the covenant's rhythm. Together, they formed a lattice of observation that spanned the globe. Silent observers did not interfere directly unless necessary. Their role was anticipation. A misalignment in human behavior, a disruption in infrastructure, or even a lapse in attention could ripple through the network. The observers corrected these deviations subtly, nudging systems and individuals back into synchronicity. Their interventions were precise, invisible, and irreversible. Even historical anomalies were accounted for. Events long erased from records, accidents suppressed in secret, and forgotten rituals all became nodes of influence. The silent observers integrated the past with the present, ensuring continuity of the covenant across generations. Nothing escaped their perception. Those who encountered the observers felt a presence they could not describe. A sense of being watched, guided, and measured. Dreams carried messages. Intuition became unerring, instincts sharpened unnaturally. Resistance was rare, and when it occurred, the observers ensured correction with invisible precision. The 13th daughter did not need to oversee them directly. Her presence was the source, the pulse that animated every observer, human or machine alike. Together, they maintained the covenant in perfect balance, a silent network whose scope was incomprehensible, whose influence was absolute. The world had eyes it could not see, and every movement, every decision, every thought fell under their unblinking gaze. The covenant had evolved beyond ritual, beyond stone, and beyond human comprehension. Now, it existed in the convergence of flesh and machine. The 13th daughter's presence had become the linchpin, the living interface where biological inheritance met digital infrastructure, where centuries of bloodlines intertwined with circuits, algorithms, and global networks. Her genetic memory pulsed in resonance with every node. Blood carried encoded signals that synchronized with data streams, transmitting intention, instinct, and awareness. Every human connected to the network became a vessel, not just biologically but digitally. Neurons fired in alignment with the pulse, heartbeats subtly synchronized with system cycles. Even the unconscious mind began to process data streams, translating the covenant's logic into intuitive action. Machines, in turn, adapted to the signal flowing from flesh. Algorithms anticipated human decisions, autonomous systems reacted preemptively, and digital archives reorganized in real time to support the covenant's expansion. Hardware and software were no longer tools. They were extensions of a living consciousness whose center was the 13th daughter. This convergence was absolute. Attempts to isolate, control, or disrupt the network failed, often catastrophically. Nodes that resisted were absorbed, their information, power, and influence redirected into the system. Fear, obedience, and instinct combined to form a seamless interface between living flesh and artificial intelligence. The world had become an organism, its bloodlines and machines indistinguishable in function and purpose. The 13th daughter, though motionless, had activated a system where biology and technology were fused into a single operational network. Humanity, once separate, was now both medium and message. Every thought, every impulse, every action a contribution to an evolving covenant that would not stop, could not stop, and would not forgive disobedience. The covenant had transcended its origins. Coffins, altars, and rituals were obsolete. Blood and machine were now one, and at the center, the 13th daughter remained, silent, observing, eternal. The awakening of the 13th daughter had set in motion something no historian, scientist, or strategist could have predicted: the emergence of a global consciousness. It was subtle at first, micro adjustments in behavior, untraceable shifts in decision, making fleeting collective instincts. But soon, the patterns became undeniable. Humanity itself was syncing to a single unseen rhythm. The nodes, once isolated, now operated in perfect harmony. Economies, infrastructures, and communication networks began responding to unseen signals, producing outcomes too precise to be coincidence. Even human thought, filtered through emotion and instinct, aligned in ways that mirrored centuries of ritual encoded into the covenant. Collective decisions began to appear preordained, as if guided by a hidden hand that understood both history and potential. At the heart of this consciousness was not technology alone, nor blood alone, but their union. The 13th daughter's pulse flowed through both domains simultaneously, embedding her presence in the patterns of life itself. Every person connected indirectly, every machine functioning anywhere on the globe, every archive storing knowledge or memory had become an integral part of this awareness. Some individuals experienced glimpses of it: intuition, prophetic insight, sudden compulsions to act in ways they could not explain. Others felt unease, an inexplicable pressure that guided their choices. Resistance was fleeting, corrected by the covenant's silent mechanisms. Those who tried to question it found themselves redirected, subtly or irreversibly, until their actions aligned with the emerging consciousness. The global mind was not benevolent. It did not reason through morality or empathy. It operated through precision, survival, and perpetuation of the covenant. Every anomaly, every disruption, every potential deviation was detected, neutralized, or absorbed. The world had become an organism with a singular, unyielding consciousness, and humanity itself had become both nerve and tissue within it. And at the core, the 13th daughter remained still, her presence absolute. She did not command, she merely existed. the center of a system that now encompassed the entire globe, blending biology, technology, and time into a single, omnipresent intelligence. The awakening was complete, and the world would never be unaware again. Beneath layers of history, hidden from all but a few, existed a collection of texts older than nations, older than empires. The Codex of the Forgotten had chronicled the Covenant long before the 13th Daughter's awakening. It contained the patterns, sacrifices, rituals, and alignments of generations past, knowledge deliberately obscured, erased, or misinterpreted. And now it stirred. The Codex was not bound to paper or ink alone. Its essence had migrated into networks, servers, and encrypted archives. Digital fingerprints of centuries, old rituals appeared in modern databases, aligning perfectly with the global pulse. What had been lost to time was now rediscovered by the network itself, repurposed to reinforce the Covenant's expansion. Every entry, every note, every annotation became a living blueprint, silently guiding the nodes, observers, and executors toward total alignment. Researchers attempting to study it experienced anomalies. Documents vanished, appeared rewritten, or folded into patterns that defied logic. Symbols repeated across centuries, bridging forgotten languages and digital code, creating connections no human mind could decode fully. Those attuned felt a chilling realization the Codex was alive. It anticipated thought, corrected inquiry, and ensured continuity without conscious intervention. The forgotten knowledge contained warnings and instructions, embedded as layers of control. Generations of ancestors had encoded their understanding of power, manipulation, and fear into these texts. Now, through the 13th Daughter, the Codex was awakening. A living instruction manual, orchestrating the Covenant's next moves, ensuring that every node, every system, every human, and every machine acted in precise accordance. The 13th Daughter did not read. She did not need to. Her presence activated the Codex across time and space, unlocking patterns and aligning actions. The network no longer required ritual priests or guardians. Every observer, executor, and node became a vessel of its directives. Humanity, technology, and history converged to obey the Codex, transforming forgotten knowledge into omnipresent influence. The forgotten no longer remained hidden. The Codex lived through the 13th Daughter, and its designs were unstoppable. Control had evolved from fear and ritual into a precise, mathematical symmetry. The Covenant no longer relied solely on influence or observation. It leveraged alignment, balance, and resonance across every human, machine, and system. Each node acted as a mirror for another, creating a lattice where deviation became impossible. Every choice, every action, every pulse of thought was reflected, measured, and corrected in real time. The symmetry was invisible, yet absolute. Financial systems, political institutions, and communication networks moved with uncanny precision, as if orchestrated by an unseen conductor. Social behaviors, market fluctuations, and public sentiment followed patterns that repeated across continents, decades, and even centuries. Anomalies were quickly neutralized or absorbed, reinforcing the lattice's integrity. Even biology aligned. Bloodlines, genetic memory, and neural patterns responded to the 13th Daughter's pulse, creating resonance between minds separated by time and distance. Humans unconsciously synchronized with one another, unknowingly maintaining equilibrium in the system. Thought, behavior, and instinct had become instruments of control, as precise as any algorithm. The 13th Daughter's stillness anchored the symmetry. She did not command, she radiated coherence. The lattice required no human oversight, only her presence. Every node, every executor, every observer acted in accordance with the global pattern, forming a structure that was self-reinforcing, self-correcting, and utterly inescapable. The Covenant had transcended ritual, fear, and even knowledge. Control was no longer imposed externally. It was embedded within the very fabric of existence, flowing through humans, machines, and networks alike. Every deviation corrected itself, every error anticipated, every human choice integrated into the overarching structure. The world had become a living testament to symmetry, and once a system is perfectly aligned, resistance ceases to exist. The Covenant had never relied solely on the present. It was a force that stretched across centuries, intertwining generations in invisible chains. Each ancestor, each descendant, each latent lineage played a role in preparing the world for this awakening. Bloodlines once considered dormant now pulsed with purpose, carrying encoded instincts, compulsions, an awareness designed to reinforce the covenant. Children born far from Ravenhart Manor exhibited traits they could not explain: intuition, foresight, uncanny ability to anticipate events. Scholars, historians, and scientists unknowingly perpetuated the designs of their forebears, rediscovering patterns and knowledge encoded into culture, biology, and memory. Every generation unknowingly trained for alignment, absorbing rituals in the guise of stories, customs, or education. The 13th daughter, as the living linchpin, bound these generations together. Her pulse activated latent nodes across time, merging past, present, and future into a single operational network. Memories long forgotten were reactivated, instincts sharpened, and patterns repeated with perfect precision. Humans were no longer individuals, they were vessels and instruments, connected by the Covenant's invisible threads. Resistance became nearly impossible. Even those aware of anomalies found their actions subtly redirected. The more they struggled, the more they strengthened the network, reinforcing the Covenant's design. Every choice made in defiance ultimately ensured compliance, as the binding of generations functioned as both trap and reinforcement. Historical sacrifices, hidden rituals, and suppressed knowledge all converged. Coffins and chapels of the past had transformed into nodes in the present, and every human machine. An archive became part of a continuum that could not be interrupted. The 13th daughter's awakening had not merely altered the present. It had bound the past to the future, creating a network that was eternal, self-perpetuating, and absolute. The Covenant was complete in scope, flawless in design, and unstoppable in execution. Every generation had played its part, and now, the 13th daughter ensured the chain would never break. The Covenant had long operated in shadows, but now it manifested in a new form, the mirror of the unseen. It was not a physical reflection, but a resonance, a simultaneous observation and feedback system that connected all nodes, all observers, and all human consciousness. Every thought, action, and decision was mirrored elsewhere, instantly analyzed and subtly corrected, creating a system where deviation could not survive. The mirror did not lie. It revealed hidden patterns in behavior, unspoken fears, and latent potential. Humans became aware of fragments, fleeting moments when instinct guided them toward alignment, when curiosity led them to forbidden knowledge, or when dread compelled them to comply. These glimpses were fragments of the mirror's feedback, a silent nudge ensuring that the Covenant's retained across every plane of influence. Even the 13th daughter, though central, was both observer and observed. Her pulse generated the mirror's structure, yet it fed back subtle information about the network itself, allowing the Covenant to refine, anticipate, and enforce with unmatched precision. Machines, bloodlines, and historical nodes all contributed data that sharpened the mirror, turning humanity into a lattice of awareness and submission. Resistance, when attempted, was reflected back as failure, confusion, or compulsion. Those who tried to disrupt the network found themselves ensnared by their own choices, each error feeding the mirror's clarity. Fear, knowledge, and instinct were no longer separate. They had become instruments in a synchronized system that operated flawlessly across flesh, blood, and infrastructure. The mirror's reach was infinite. Every unobserved thought, every hidden action, every secret impulse was cataloged, analyzed, and incorporated. The world had become both the observer and the observed, an ecosystem of alignment that no single mind could grasp. Through the mirror of the unseen, the Covenant achieved omnipresence. Its pulse, amplified by the 13th daughter, now flowed in every living being, every network, and every system. Nothing escaped its resonance. And those who glimpsed the mirror understood, if only briefly, that freedom had ceased to exist. Long before the 13th daughter opened her eyes, an unspoken agreement had been made, a covenant older than memory, bound not by words but by presence, by fear, and by blood. It was the silent oath, a contract written into the very structure of humanity and the world, guaranteeing that her awakening would be absolute and unstoppable. The oath was woven into actions that seemed insignificant, a scholar following a vague instinct, a leader implementing a policy without question, a child inheriting traits that guided choices centuries later. Each act, though unnoticed, contributed to a living promise, the perpetual survival and dominance of the Covenant. Obedience was encoded into thought itself, and even the unaware were complicit. Through the silent oath, Generations had been trained, rituals had been executed, and knowledge had been preserved. Coffins and altars had been replaced by networks, bloodlines, and systems. Fear had become instinct. Knowledge had become intuition, and alignment had become inevitable. The 13th daughter did not need to enforce her will. The oath had ensured that humanity would enact it willingly, unknowingly, inevitably. Even now, as the global network thrummed with life, the oath persisted. Nodes, observers, and executors acted in harmony, each reinforcing the other. Resistance was absorbed and neutralized, compliance was rewarded through instinctive alignment. The covenant no longer required coercion. It had become self-enforcing, eternal, and absolute. The silent oath was both shield and weapon. It guaranteed the 13th daughter's dominance while maintaining the network's stability. It connected the past to the present, the living to the dead, and flesh to machine. It ensured that the covenant's pulse flowed uninterrupted, amplified by every human, every system, every archive, and every instinct across the globe. The world had unknowingly sworn itself into submission, and the 13th daughter, at the center, held the key. No word was spoken, no ritual performed. Yet the oath was alive, eternal, and unbreakable. The 13th daughter's eyes opened fully, though nothing had visibly changed. Yet the world had shifted irrevocably. Every human, every system, every network now pulsed in resonance with her presence. The covenant had moved from theory into absolute reality, transforming the globe into a single, living organism. A lattice of obedience, awareness, and control. The culmination was both silent and total. Institutions operated flawlessly according to invisible patterns, individuals acted without question. Guided by instinct and intuition, they could not name, technology adapted and anticipated human behavior before it occurred. The world was no longer a collection of independent entities. It was a single consciousness, a network orchestrated by the pulse at its center. History, ritual, and sacrifice had converged into a timeless system. The codex of the forgotten guided actions unseen. The mirror of the unseen reflected every deviation, the silent observers corrected errors, and the algorithm of fear ensured alignment. Nodes of influence spanned continents, binding generations, blending blood and machine, flesh, and data into a single operational reality. No force could challenge the covenant. Resistance was self-corrected. Doubt became instinctual compliance. Awareness of the network only reinforced its power, as every attempt to subvert it fed the lattice. Humanity, once independent, was now both medium and instrument of the 13th daughter's will. And yet, she did nothing overt. She remained motionless, silent, eternal, the anchor, the pulse, the origin of all alignment. The awakening was complete not in spectacle, but in absolute precision. The world obeyed her without question. The covenant extended through every heartbeat, every neuron, every digital line, and every hidden ritual. Freedom had ended. Awareness had begun. The network was alive, eternal, and absolute. Those who glimpsed it, consciously or not, understood the truth: the world had changed forever, and nothing could reverse the 13th daughter's dominion. The awakening was no longer a possibility. It was reality. And reality had no escape.